could you provide us a brief historical introduction to Buddhism, assuming that our listeners, and of course including myself, would be completely ignorant about it. It is somewhat neglected aspect of philosophy.
So the first thing to get your head around is that Buddhism isn't one thing. Okay. And it's not one thing in at least two different senses. It's not one thing because it originated about 2,500 years ago. I'll come back to that. And it's developed in at least two major subcontinents, India and China, over a period of 2,500 years. And in that time, a number of different traditions have developed. They have certain commonalities, of course, but they disagree about many things. And what we're now witnessing is Buddhist thought moving into the West in exactly the same way that Buddhist thought moved from India to China about 2,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago, depends how you date this thing. It's now moving into the West, and it's morphing again in the process, just as Buddhism morphed as it moved from India to China. So we're going to be witnessing changes in Buddhist ideas over the next 100 years. So one shouldn't run away with the thought that Buddhist thought is all one thing. The second way in which Buddhism is not one thing is this. Buddhism is many things, at least maybe better, has many aspects. It's a religion, it's a philosophy, it's an aesthetic, think of a Buddhist art. It's a bunch of power structures, it's about a bunch of social institutions, it's a bunch of texts. Of course, there are connections between these things, but you shouldn't forget those are really very different things. And I can't claim to know much about most aspects of Buddhism. The only aspect of Buddhism I don't really know much about is the philosophy. And I think I would really want to insist that there's a difference between the philosophy and the religion. So philosophy is a bunch of ideas, philosophical views, and how one defends these things, as we talked about earlier. And that's not the same as the religious practices that go with Buddhism, the power structure, the social institutions, the rites, the chants, the religious practices, which include, meditation, I guess. I'm not suggesting these things aren't important, but the only thing I have much expertise in is the philosophy. So I'm going to sort of stick to that. Okay, so those are two warnings. So let's come back to the development of Buddhist philosophy. So Buddhism starts with the thinker, Siddhartha Gautama. We don't know the dates exactly, but it's around the 5th or maybe the 6th century BCE, who's living somewhere in northeast India. Maybe it comes from Nepal, no one knows. He sees the world, he understands that in many ways it's not a happy place. And he starts to wonder why and how, what can be done to make it a better place. And he sort of pursues this quest for a number of years until, according to history, he achieves enlightenment. Enlightenment's kind of an odd word. The literal Sanskrit means something like awakening. So he's sort of, been in a sort of dream before, been going around without really understanding the world, and then suddenly he gets it. So the Japanese satori for awakening really means he's got it. Okay, so he gets it. And then he teaches and spreads his ideas for another 40, 50 or so years till he dies. And by that time, he's established a group of people around him who he teaches and who develop his ideas and so on. Let's come back to the early ideas in a minute. Let's just talk about the development for the moment. So, Buddhism then flourishes in India for about 500 years in what one might think of as the earlier forms, historically earlier forms. So sometimes these are called the Abhidharma schools. The Abhidharma schools are the texts which sort of articulate many of the insights in the early Buddhist teachings. There are many Abhidharma schools, but only one of them is extant today. That's a school called Theravada, and you find that mainly now in Southeast Asia. But around the turn of the Common Era, you get a sea change. You get the development of a whole new kind of Buddhism called Mahayana, the Great Vehicle. And this is marked by developments in Buddhist philosophy of both an ethical and a metaphysical kind. So it doesn't actually change what's gone before, but it sort of takes some bit more to heart, you know. You get certainly a major philosophical change. On the ethical front, the major change concerns compassion becoming the central virtue. On the metaphysical front, the major change is in this notion of emptiness, which you mentioned earlier, and we should come back to. So Mahayana starts to kick off in India around the turn of the Common Era, and immediately, within the next couple of 400 years, it develops into two quite distinct schools. One is developed by probably the most influential philosopher, Buddhist philosopher ever, at least, you know, except the Buddha himself, the Indian philosopher Nagarjuna, who's working around the 2nd century. And his school is called Madhyamaka, middle way. And then a few hundred years later, you get the development of another kind of Mahayana called Yogacara. And these guys are kind of idealists. And then after that, you get various syncretists. There's an enormous Buddhist institution in northeast India called Nalanda. At its height, there must have been 10,000 Buddhist scholars working there. It gets sacked as a process of the Muslim invasions in about the 12th century. There are stories that when it was sacked, the library burned for a month, like the Library of Alexandria. But whatever, I mean, Buddhism waned or ceased to exist in India. So you don't find much Buddhism in India today. Actually, that has changed slightly because of the Tibetan diaspora. When China invaded Tibet, I mean, lots of the Tibetans came. So you do find Buddhist institutions in India today, but there's not much Buddhist thinking in India between the 12th century and now. But although it disappeared in India, it went elsewhere in the world. So the older forms of Buddhism tended to go southeast. So you will find them today in Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Thailand. Mahayana went in the opposite direction. It went northwest. So it goes up through Pakistan, what you might call the stands, okay, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and all these stand places. And you've got to remember that around the time we're talking about, this was a Greek colony. I mean, Alexander had invaded the whole of Central Asia and parts of India. And so you get enormous Greek influence on these things. You only got to look at Buddhist art from this period to see the Greek influence. Okay, so Mahayana Buddhism tends to go northwest, and from thence into China, because there is a major trade route that runs right across Central Asia. It started from Xi'an in China, which was the ancient capital, and goes all the way to the Middle East, Greece, Turkey, and so on. And there were merchants going backwards and forwards, and merchants carry silks and spices and so on, because merchants love to talk. So ideas go across the Silk Route. And so Buddhism enters China, presumably across the Silk Route, around the turn of the Common Era, and it's Mahayana. And when it hits China, it meets the two great indigenous Chinese philosophies. One of these is Confucianism, and one of these is Taoism. And of those two, in the history of Chinese Buddhism, it was Taoism which was of major importance. So there are many resonances between Buddhism and Taoism. They're not the same, but certainly, if you don't know much about both, you might think they're kind of the same. And certainly, when Buddhism goes into China, the Chinese tend to see it as an exotic form of Taoism. The translations of the Sanskrit texts aren't terribly accurate at this time. And they kind of think, well, you know, how could anything good have come out of a place as backwards as India? I mean, you know, great ideas come from us. So, you know, this Buddhism to the sense any good, must be something like Taoism. Okay, so good translations of the Sanskrit texts really start to be made around the 4th or the 5th century. And very important Chinese people go and study in India, including at Nalanda, this Buddhist university. And so by about the 5th or the 6th century, they know that Buddhism is not Taoism, even though there are resonances. And some of the early forms of Mahayana Buddhism flourish for a while, but what happens around the 6th century is that you get the development of the distinctively Chinese forms of Buddhism. These are all Mahayana, okay? But there are about at least four major schools of Chinese Mahayana Buddhism, which are distinctively different from Indian Buddhisms. And the major reason they differ is because of the Taoist influence. By this time, you know, the connection between Taoism and Buddhism was so entrenched in what you might call the Chinese mind that it had to be this way. And so that's one of the things that makes the Chinese forms of Buddhism very, very distinctive. Most people will never have heard of the Chinese forms of Buddhism, except one, which is called Chan, and they won't know it by that name. They'll know it by its Japanese name, which is Zen, because all the forms of Chinese Buddhism spread throughout the rest of East Asia. They go down the Korean Peninsula into Japan. And so you get the flourishing of Buddhism in Japan. Particularly around the 12th century, you get some very distinctive forms of Japanese Buddhism, but also the sort of flourishing of Chinese Buddhisms like Zen. Okay, so that's a sort of very brief summary of the development of the history and geography of Buddhism.
रंग पिचकारी